It's never easy to admit when you're struggling with an illness, especially when it involves something as sensitive as mental health. We often think we can handle things on our own, but sometimes the weight becomes too heavy to bear. Unfortunately, this was the reality for David Crespi, especially when his mind began to go to dark side. David Crespi was born into a family of high achievers in Sacramento, California. Both David, his brother, and his father all graduated from California State University. David earned his degree in accounting in 1983, graduating with honors. His brother John went on to become a respected economics professor at Kansas State University. With his qualifications, David had no trouble finding work. He began his career at a local bank and quickly worked his way up to the role of financial director. However, when the bank closed in 1986, he transitioned to a new job in mortgage lending in Sacramento. David's life seemed to be following a perfect trajectory. After his first marriage, he and his wife had 2 children, Jessica and Josh. Tragically, his first wife passed away from a brain tumor. This devastated him. In the face of this grief, David got himself into his work and made it his mission to provide for his children. Kimberly, a woman from David's past, whom he had known from their university days, re-entered his life. Initially just friends, their relationship evolved, and soon they started living together. In 1994 they married, and Kimberly adopted David's children from his first marriage. In 1997 they had a son, Josh, followed by twins, Tessa and Samantha, in 2001. In 2001, David was offered a new position at a promising bank, and the family moved to the quiet town of Matthews in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina. By 2006, David had achieved the American dream. At 45, he was the vice president of Ecovia Bank, living in a beautiful 3-story house in a safe, rich neighborhood. The family was very close, involved in their local church, and appeared to be living a picture-perfect life. However, behind this success, David had been battling his internal struggle for years. He suffered from severe depression. The first signs of his mental health struggles appeared in his 20s. At that time, he brushed it off as just another phase, a reaction to the usual ups and downs of life. But in adulthood, his condition became worse. David's depression started after the death of his first wife. Kimberly, who came into his life after, was a tremendous support, but love could not fully lift him from his dark thoughts. He went on therapy and took prescribed medications, but David's condition never truly stabilized. In 2000, Kimberly convinced David to see a psychiatrist, and he began a course of antidepressants. However, the side effects of the medication, including rapid weight gain, made David uncomfortable. He tried another prescription, hoping to find something more effective. Over the years, he continued to battle his mental health, but the episodes of depression became more intense, and his fear of losing everything he had and working for life, his job, his family, and his life, became overwhelming. In 2006, David's mental state deteriorated. He struggled with violent thoughts on a regular basis. David's dark thoughts began to shift, from no longer focusing on himself but on harming others. It reached a boiling point on January 20, 2006. On that day, he was at home with his wife, Kimberly, and their 5-year-old twin daughters, Tessa and Samantha. Kimberly left to run to the store, trusting that her husband would look after their daughters. The last time she spoke to him, everything seemed normal. She had no idea that her husband's dark thoughts would soon manifest most horrifically. David's depression, combined with a growing sense of paranoia, led to a catastrophic decision. While playing a hiding game with his daughters, David took knives from the shelf and put them on the counter in the kitchen. First, he attacked Samantha. He put her on the counter and stabbed her repeatedly. She was screaming, and Tessa heard it and came downstairs. She saw what was happening and ran to hide in the second-floor bathroom, but David found her and did the same. He stabbed her as well. Both girls died from the injuries they sustained. Afterward, David, in a state of calm, called 911, confessing to the murders. The dispatcher tried to guide him through life-saving procedures, but David said that girls were beyond any possible help. He told the dispatcher he wanted to die. The police arrived at the house and arrested David without resistance. Kimberly, who had just returned from the store, was devastated by the tragic truth. David's mental health struggles had escalated to a point where they caused him to act on his darkest impulses. He was placed under constant surveillance in jail, where he would be evaluated for his mental condition. Despite his actions, David's wife Kimberly stood by him, expressing her belief that his depression and the psychosis that accompanied it led to the killings. She felt that her husband, who had always been a loving and kind man, was overwhelmed by mental illness. The prosecution offered a plea deal. David would plead guilty to the double murder in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, avoiding the death penalty. David's defense attorneys argued that his actions were the result of his long-standing struggle with severe mental health issues, including depression and psychosis. Kimberly was heartbroken by the loss of their daughters and supported her husband in this decision, believing that his illness should be acknowledged and treated rather than leading to a death sentence. Despite the brutal nature of the crime, she argued that David's life still held value and that he deserved a chance at redemption, even behind bars. This case continues to raise questions about the relationship between mental illness and violent crime. It challenges us to consider the complexity of human behavior and the deep struggles that can remain hidden even in the most seemingly stable lives. Against this background, the lawyers prepared a serious basis for arguing against the death sentence. It was based on David's history of mental illness, which had been present for over 2 decades before this tragedy. He had never broken the law and was considered a decent family man and citizen. There were no cases of aggressive behavior in the past. He had never raised a hand against his wife or children, which was confirmed by his wife Kimberly and the entire family. The defense insisted that on January 20th, mental illness had taken over David, leading to the tragic loss of his 2 children. They, along with all of David's relatives, were certain that he had been in a state of psychosis. Kimberly spoke in court on her husband's behalf. She insisted that David had spent decades trying to suppress his mental problems and had largely succeeded. They used medical help, and doctors prescribed him medications. However, in her opinion, these treatments were ineffective. For years, the family had followed the prescribed treatment plan strictly, taking the medications as directed. However, a psychiatric examination later revealed that David had much more serious conditions than initially believed. Instead of the usual depressive state and anxiety, he was diagnosed with psychosis. It became clear that the medications he had been prescribed were ineffective. But David was still recognized as sane at the time of the killings. Additionally, David had been diagnosed with genital cancer, and while treatment had been successful, he still had to visit a doctor for a follow-up exam on the day of the killings. His lawyers presented medical documents confirming that David had been taking several medications, one for depression, another for anxiety, and a third to help with sleep. However, while taking the antidepressant, David gained more than 20 kilograms and began experiencing shortness of breath, which led him to stop taking that medication. His attending physician then prescribed a different antidepressant in January, but it didn't help because David still couldn't sleep properly. According to the lawyers, a fateful decision was made just the day before the murders. The doctor canceled the sedatives and sleeping pills and prescribed another sleeping medication. After that, David began to experience strange changes in his mental state, which made him unable to think clearly. The day before the murder, David was in a state of hallucination. His fears increased that he would no longer be able to provide for his family. However, according to the management of the bank where David worked, he had an excellent work record and there were no indications he would lose his job. He had more than enough money to support his family in any situation. Despite this, his mental state made him vulnerable even when there was no basis for them. David was also afraid he would not receive the next bonus from the bank. He had received $45,000 the previous year, but he feared he would not be paid that amount again. It later emerged that the bank had approved the largest bonus of David's career. These irrational fears were a direct result of his mental state, and he was unable to think clearly. While waiting for the hearings for the double murder case, Kimberly visited her husband frequently along with their daughter. She repeatedly stated that she still loved him and believed that one day his illness could be overcome, enabling him to cope with it and avoid such bloody tragedies. Kimberly knew David as a kind and loving person and believed it was the wrong treatment that had caused the deaths of their children. A forensic expert discovered more than a dozen stab wounds on each of the girls, the majority of which were on their upper bodies. It was obvious that their father had tried to ensure they had no chance of surviving. Defensive wounds were also found on the twins' arms. However, these injuries were not enough to save their lives. All the police officers who responded to the call that morning agreed that the scene was the most traumatic and horrifying experience of their professional careers, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. David admitted that when the twins were 1 year old, he had considered harming them. On one occasion, while walking in the backyard with the girls, he had put a butcher's knife in his pocket, but thankfully, he was able to pull himself together and stop himself. According to David, he had repeatedly struggled with the urge to harm family members, but had always been able to control those thoughts. He believed he had everything under control and would never act on these impulses. However, on the morning of the killings, after his wife left the house to the store, David, who was working at his computer, suddenly had an obsessive thought. He needed to kill his children. He believed that once they were dead, all his worries would end, because there would be no one left to take care of. At that moment, David understood that this was connected to his mental problems, but he was convinced that it was the day the twins had to die. Without any doubt, he proceeded to deliver 32 stubs to his defenseless daughters. He was not going to leave them alive. During the first interrogations, David gave harsh and confident answers when asked why he killed both girls and not just one of them. He coldly explained that since they were twins, they had to die together. His cold-blooded logic was chilling, but it changed when David received full treatment in prison. Only then did he realize the full extent of his crime. David admitted that he had never disclosed his thoughts of killing his children, even when, on the way home from a visit to the doctor, he had briefly entertained thoughts of harming strangers. Kimberly had never realized the full danger of her husband's condition, and David's attending physician a day before had no responsibility for the tragedy. The doctor had been misled by David, who had hidden a lot of information, leaving the specialist unable to properly assess his condition. Additionally, each drug has its own side effects, which manifest differently in each person. The doctor could not have predicted how David would react to the medication. After receiving qualified help and treatment in prison, David's mental state improved. At the preliminary hearing, he fully admitted his guilt and recognized the severity of his actions. Psychiatrists confirmed that he was now mentally stable and fit to stand trial, but the 2 innocent girls could never be brought back. David's family could not believe what had happened. His father had seen him just a week before the murders, and he appeared to be in good shape. Nothing shows the tragedy that would unfold. On July 30, 2006, a hearing was held for the double murder of the 5-year-old girls. In the end, David made a plea deal and admitted his guilt, and the prosecutor's office decided not to seek the death penalty, which was a relief, especially for Kimberly. The trial was brief, and David was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Despite the speed of the trial, David's family and loved ones were in tears. David himself could not hold back his emotions, as he fully grasped the cruelty of his actions and knew he would live with the guilt for the rest of his life. Even the police officers who arrived at the scene that day were deeply affected, recalling the experience with tears in their eyes. One officer, a young man, had gone up to the second floor and found Tessa's body. He checked her pulse, thinking she was still alive, and carried her downstairs in the hope that she might survive. But when the doctors examined her, they confirmed she had already died from her injuries. The officer had mistaken his own heartbeat for the pulse of the dying child. To this day, questions remain about whether David was truly unaware of his actions at the time of the killings. Some doubt whether he could have been in a psychotic state he couldn't control. His behavior seemed normal at times. He spoke with his mother, worked at home, and appeared calm. His violence started only after his wife left the house. This sequence of events raises many questions about whether David was truly unaware of what he was doing or if he was able to control himself during the murders. Currently, David is in prison in North Carolina, and Kimberly continues to advocate for awareness of the dangerous side effects of the medications he was prescribed. Thank you for watching.